Hey, so there is a number of issues that I want to cover in this video, so please bear with me. It's going to be a longer video, but all the issues are amalgamated together because they are interrelated, I think. And I think they're all topical. So I want to talk about a number of issues around male feminists, chivalry, gender identity issues, or gender politics in relation to this, and my thoughts on it. Um, Sometimes what I do, just out of sheer interest, is type a random word into Google and stick up images to see what comes up. And usually it's memes, right? So I typed in mangina. You've probably heard this word. It's a pejorative term to describe men who are seen as being submissive to women. Um, Two statements came up, or two memes came up that caught my interest. A lot of them were just kind of childish and taking the piss and so on, but two came up that were in defense of so-called manginas. Um, One of them said, if supporting women's rights makes me a mangina, book me in for a Brazilian. And the second one said, strong men respect strong women. Weak men think strong women have an attitude. Now, if you type in mangina to Google images, all this stuff comes up, so you'll see what I'm referring to. Want to look at those two memes a little bit, the two ones that I've just quoted, and analyze that a little bit, the implications of what they're trying to say. Um, Firstly, a quick word about this term mangina. I don't personally use it, and this is where I perhaps differentiate from hardline MRAs. Men's rights activists. I believe in having adult discourse on issues. I tend to avoid playground insults, and it works both ways. Feminists certainly come out with their fair share, but I don't think you win a debate by this sort of terminology and throwing it around. And I'm not being politically correct with that. I just think it's a bit childish. That's all. Um, but let's break down the statement. If caring about women's rights makes me a mangina, then book me in for a Brazilian. Now, I don't know if that meme is supporting male feminism or just women's rights, because it's not the same thing. I've argued before that it is very compatible to support women's rights whilst having an issue with the way modern Western feminism has taken course. Um, Now, that meme is obviously suggesting that this accusation of so-called manginas is leveled at just guys who support women's rights. This isn't entirely the case. Um, I think it's very, very compatible to support women's rights, support men's rights, and support human rights without being self-deprecating. Um, I'll come on to the second statement in a minute, but although I don't support the usage of this term, I do understand where it comes from. I think it comes from a frustration from other men, i.e., outside male feminists. And I'm not talking about all male feminists, but there is a certain type of male feminist that is very smug, kind of has this holier than thou attitude, and quite frankly does seem self deprecating and self flagellating, metaphorically speaking. Um, what you have to understand is it's one thing being in support of women's rights, nothing wrong with that. It's quite another slavishly agreeing with female feminists no matter what. And that to me is how some of these guys come across. I've actually been in a debate before with a male feminist who said, we men rule the world, women live in a world of fear. They wake up every day fearing the patriarchy. Now, to be clear, he wasn't referring to Afghanistan. He wasn't referring to a part of the world where women really are treated like dirt. He was talking about the UK, Western society. And that's the sort of mindset I am talking about. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's outright self hatred, but it is self deprecating. It reminds me a little bit of campaigners about 9 years ago when we were marking the 200th anniversary of the abolition of the slave trade. I remember seeing a photograph of a guy who basically had a big T-shirt saying "So sorry," and he had himself in chains. White guy had himself in chains, and he was down on his knees saying sorry. This is nonsense. And I don't want to go off on a tangent and talk about another subject, but that sort of self-deprecating attitude to me is doesn't prove anything. I don't think it is representing values at all. I think it is nonsense. I think it's perfectly possible to acknowledge injustice, acknowledge issues that, for example, impact women, um, without beating up your own gender. And that's what some male feminists basically do. They slander their fellow men. They constantly insinuate that being a man is something to be ashamed of. And this is not a case of, oh, we have to be masculine men. And, it's not even about that. It's simply about having a penis. They actually insinuate that being male, and I'm not talking about gender identity here, I'm talking about biology, being male is something to feel guilty about. And they're basically pandering to these hate filled, misandrist feminist extremists. I'm not talking about all feminists, I'm talking about the extremists. But that mentality does pander to that sort of attitude. Nobody, nobody should feel guilty for something that's beyond our control. So nobody should feel guilty for their skin pigmentation or their gender, biological gender. It's just stupid. It's a very stupid mentality. There's nothing wrong with being open minded and acknowledging, for example, historically there are examples where women have had a raw deal, or historically white people kept slaves. Nothing wrong with that. That's honesty. That's reflecting on history honestly. But there is something wrong with being so constantly self-flagellating and trying to make other people feel guilty as well. It's nonsense. So, okay, some of these memes are a bit childish, but I do see what they're driving at because that's a perception that comes across. And all I would say respectfully to male feminists is there is nothing wrong with calling yourself a feminist. There's nothing wrong with identifying yourself whatever way you want. But you cannot impose that onto other men and try to make other men feel guilty simply because they don't label themselves the way you do. It's stupid. Now, the second meme, excuse me, I've got somewhat painful mouth ulcers at the moment. The second meme said, strong men respect strong women, weak men think they've got an attitude. That's all very well, but the number one thing I was thinking about there was how do you define a strong woman? I mean, what's the definition exactly? No one can actually point to what a strong woman is. To me, you get strong people who have strong strength of character. They have a lot of confidence. They've got tough skin, and they don't play a victimhood mentality. That to me is strong personal character. Um, Examples of strong women, I guess you could say Margaret Thatcher, Indira Gandhi, um, Malala Yousafzai. They're all strong women in their own way. Um, I think Malala is 18 now, so young woman. But this is just another example of something that has been kind of taken by the feminist movement to basically bash men. So let's say, for the sake of argument, a man and a woman are arguing, and he genuinely believes that she does have an attitude. Feminists will portray that as him being a weak man, not liking a strong woman. But does anyone actually stop to think maybe she really does just have an attitude? Because if a man basically spoke down to women, he would be called a misogynist, he would be called a patriarchal brute who wants to keep women in control. But if a feminist basically insults men, disrespects men, then she is a strong woman. This is bullshit. It's complete double standards. Being a strong woman is not about degrading men and talking down to men and treating men like shit. That's not strength. That's sheer obnoxiousness. So that meme, obviously I can't read too much into it, but I assume that's what it's driving at. That if you that being a strong woman is somehow about being obnoxious, it's not. So when a man calls a woman a bitch, or he says she has an attitude, it might well be because that is what she is doing. She is being bitchy, or she does have an attitude. How is that any different from calling a man a bastard? It's no different. I'm not saying it's good to insult people, but I'm just saying there's obvious double standards here. Because if a man argues with a woman and if he stands up for himself and he actually gives as good as he gets, verbally speaking, then it's basically portrayed as, oh, you can't handle a strong woman. And you have situations where basically women in positions of power get away with things that men in positions of power would not get away with. That's why I believe that men in politics have to be extremely careful. All they have to do is disagree with a female colleague, they'll be accused of bullying her, of talking down to her, of, being patriarchal. Yet a woman politician can insult male politicians and basically get away with it. No one cares. So I really do think there's double standards involved with this, and that's what pisses a lot of people off. So being a strong woman, to me, is just about strength of character. It's about being yourself, being confident, and having tough skin. It is not about talking down to men. It is not about insulting men because you interpret that as feminist strength. I mean, you get obnoxious, frankly disgusting ladettes, as we call them in the UK, who basically treat people like trash. They swear like sailors, they get into fights for no reason, they drink copious amounts of alcohol just to prove that they're as strong as the guys, except they're copying the wrong sort of men anyway. Because those sort of men who behave like that are not good male role models anyway. So if they're trying to be as good as the boys, they're copying the wrong type of men in the first place. You know, so that annoys me. It's if a woman is being arrogant and obnoxious, then when someone calls her out for that, it's not because she is a woman, it's because that is the way she's behaving. And okay, you get some men who are hypocritical and they wouldn't hold the same standards to men. Speaking personally, if someone is being obnoxious, I hold exactly the same standards if they're male or female. I can think of certain public figures who, in fact, most of the public figures I dislike are men anyway, but there are a few who are women, and I hold the same standards. So you can't have it both ways. You can't say women are just as strong and independent as men, but then as soon as they are criticised, then it becomes a feminist issue. How dare you criticise her? It's complete double standards. So that irritates me a little bit. Personally, I have no problem with women in a position of authority. When I look at political leaders, I can honestly say that gender is irrelevant to me. The only time it becomes an issue is when someone uses it to their advantage, like when they do genuinely play the woman card and they vote for me because I'm a woman, or if you don't vote for me, you're a sexist pig. Genuinely strong women do not use their gender as an advantage. They don't use it as a label because they recognize themselves. That's one reason why Margaret Thatcher was so politically successful. She was a polarizing figure, she was a controversial figure, but she never, or at least extremely rarely, used the fact that she was a woman to, her electoral advantage. In fact, it could be argued Margaret Thatcher was too domineering. It's one of the reasons she ultimately had to leave because she was basically becoming rather arrogant and she was disrespecting her male colleagues. If it had actually, ironically, if it was the other way around, in fact, it recently was when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister, he was accused of bullying. I wasn't there. I can't say whether he was or wasn't, but you know, with Margaret Thatcher, it was just domineering. With Gordon Brown, who he's a sexist bully. Well, make of that what you will. Anyway, so just to conclude what I want to say with that part of the video, I don't personally use the term mangina. I think it's a bit childish, but I do understand where this term comes from. And all I would say to male feminists is there's nothing wrong with standing up for women's rights, but you cannot impose that on other men and say you only believe in women's rights if you call yourself a feminist. If you impose that label, I think it's perfectly compatible to believe in women's rights without labeling yourself in that way. And it's seen as almost blasphemy. Like if you say that you believe in women's rights, that's not enough. It's not enough. Feminists want you to label yourself. And I've used this analogy before because I think it is apt. It's a bit like saying you can only believe in workers' rights, fair and equitable treatment for workers, if you label yourself a socialist. Or you can only believe in being tough on crime if you label yourself a conservative. People shouldn't be obliged to label themselves in any way. They should just have the liberty to believe in whatever they want to believe in. That's true liberty. Um, so I want to go on to the next issue, and like I say, do bear with me because there's a few things I want to cover here. Chivalry and its place in the 21st century. Now, I mentioned near the start of the video, one reason I'm reluctant to fully endorse the MRA movement, and I don't call myself an MRA, is because I think sometimes they pander to the whole notion of men's rights, or they kind of drive in that direction in the same way that feminists sometimes have an entire world outlook that is based on men versus women. So for feminists, it's all about female victimhood and horrible overbearing patriarchy and everything's awful. Women are downtrodden, men are, um, controlling brutes. That is basically the direction of third wave Western feminism. I'm not saying that is the mindset of individual feminists, but it is more or less the agenda and the overriding theme of Western third wave feminism. Now, one reason I'm reluctant to fully endorse the MRA movement, although I fully understand and I'm fully sympathetic to why it came about, one problem I have with it is that MRAs, too many MRAs, tend to basically behave the exact same way as feminists, except in reverse. So they make out that the whole world is against men and everything is awful for men and all women are anti male. And sometimes I think the MRA movement can come across as blaming all women for the nonsense that feminists come out with. I have even seen, for example, in videos where women have been criticizing feminism, guys calling themselves MRA have even attacked those women because they have misinterpreted the video. I've seen, for example, satirical videos where women have been parodying feminists. And these MRAs are so obsessed by their male victimhood mentality that they then attack these women who are parodying feminism. They're not calling themselves feminists. So, one reason I'm reluctant to endorse it is because I don't want to become a victim. I don't want to end up basically feeling sorry for myself and going outside and thinking, oh, all women are out to get us men. That is just as bad as the mentality of the feminists. Definitely, 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 there are issues that impact men that are underreported. So I'm not saying that the MRA movement is entirely wrong. Certainly not. But I am saying that some more extreme MRAs basically just come across as anti-women, and they'll even go so far as to deny the existence of rape, and that is wrong. It's just wrong. So, what all of this comes down to is the middle way. Those of us who actually believe in genuine egalitarianism between men and women and are sick and tired of the divisiveness that both movements cause. I mean, feminism has been prominent for longer, so I think it's more culpable for this, but both movements are guilty of being divisive. Um, and, it's not a case that I absolutely disagree with what either movement is saying. There's some feminist arguments I can agree with. There's definitely MRA arguments I can agree with. But both movements are guilty of not reining in on the extremists in the midst, because both movements have misogynists, have misandrists. Both sides do, and it's irrefutable. Um, so what I would say to moderate feminists and moderate MRAs is, by all means, do what you're doing, but don't get so defensive when people criticize the movement. You have to reflect on it, consider why people are criticizing it. So, for example, with the MRA movement, when groups like Fathers for Justice take direct action and handcuff themselves to MPs, that's counterproductive. I I understand the frustration. Okay, maybe not firsthand, but all I'm saying is any protest movement, when it uses those sort of techniques, it's counterproductive, in my opinion. Um, but I could talk about that all day, quite frankly. Anyway, I want to drive on to the issue that I was going to get at, chivalry. Now, when we think of chivalry, this is sort of a medieval concept, of course. And traditionally, it actually wasn't just about the way men treated women. It went beyond that. It was about serving king and country. It went back to medieval codes of chivalry, which actually were a lot more abstract and a lot more broad than just about, you know, what we view chivalry today, like holding doors open for women and that sort of thing. Traditionally, it went back to the medieval knights of Europe, and it probably had a lot more to do with knightly codes of conduct towards the king and towards service for God. Probably goes right back to the Crusades. So it has an interesting history. Different parts of history, we've seen different sort of, I guess you could say, chivalrous concepts. If we look at the both antebellum and postbellum Deep South in the United States, there was that sort of Southern gentleman code of conduct about being super polite to women and so on. And I think to some extent it still exists. Um, we sort of think of Gone with the Wind and that sort of thing, like really ultra ladylike ladies and men being super polite towards the ladies, that sort of thing. So there was that concept of chivalry. Um, but generally, I think when we say the term chivalry, basically the thing that people most think of is holding doors open for women and so on. For me, chivalry is, I don't even use the term chivalry particularly. I think there is such a thing as being respectful towards women in a way that is different from being respectful towards men. If you're a decent person, you're going to respect people in general, except people you disagree with, or but as a general concept, most decent people don't go outside and just be an ass, for the sake of it. If you're a decent person, you generally treat people with respect. So that's a generic thing. But I do think there are certain, let's say, approaches that are different between men and women. And this is again an area where I wouldn't entirely agree with MRAs, because they kind of take the concept to an extreme of, oh, well, if women want equality, then anything goes kind of thing. I don't entirely agree with that. For example, I would be 100% opposed to mixed martial arts bouts. And that might sound old fashioned, but I couldn't really care less. That's why, and okay, I'm probably expanding in another area here, but I'm 100% opposed to the idea of transgender, trans women competing in bouts with female martial artists. Because ultimately, you have someone with a penis who could potentially break a jaw of a female competitor. I think that's perverse, quite frankly, and I don't, I just don't think that idea should be humoured at all. Um, the fact of the matter is, men and women are different. This is a basic biological fact. Now, you get this sort of attitude from certain MRAs that is like, oh, well, equality means equality. So, my question for these guys is, well, do you have no concept of romance? Forget chivalry for a second. Just forget chivalry. And forget the whole idea of being a mangina and being subservient. Just consider romance. If you have a girlfriend or a wife, are you honestly telling me that you would not treat her in a special way? Are you honestly hand on heart saying that? That if you go out on a date, you're not going to treat her like a lady? By which I mean, pulling her chair out, paying for her on the first date. Not all the time, but at least the first date. Just treating her in a nice way. Are you honestly telling me you wouldn't do that? To me, that's a bit boring. It kind of takes away the romance factor. I can honestly say that with my girlfriends in the past, I'm single right now, but with my girlfriends that I have had, I have been, I wouldn't say subservient at all, but I would say that I have been gentleman, for want of a better term. I have treated them the way I think a man should treat a woman, in a respectful way. And it has nothing to do with wanting to please them or being a mangina. It's about simply, it gives me a sense of confidence, actually. It's the exact opposite of being a mangina. And it's exact opposite of being self deprecating. I'm a very alpha male in many ways. I really don't think there's anything wrong with just being a gentleman on a date. So what? It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean you're being subservient. It means you're just valuing the difference in male and female. So what? Um, I really don't think there's a problem with that. Um, that's why when I see men abusing women, genuinely abusing women, in no way is it being a mangina to speak out. If you see, and this is a question I have for MRAs, if you see a guy who is brutally beating his girlfriend, are you honestly telling me that it is somehow like standing up against that as being a mangina? Come on. Just like criticizing violent women doesn't mean that you're a sexist brute. It doesn't mean that you're a patriarchal whatever. It's just about being a decent human being. That's all. And when I think of my female friends, I would absolutely 100% stand up for them. I'd stand up for my male friends as well. But do I approach men and women a different way? Yes, I do. And I don't apologize for that because men and women are different. You could still recognize that fact whilst being egalitarian. I don't think it's a contradiction. So when I'm talking about egalitarianism, I'm talking about equal opportunities. I'm talking about not exhibiting double standards. But I think you could still fundamentally recognize that men and women are different. I talk to my female friends in a different way than I talk to my male friends. That's just the way it is. Um, it doesn't mean I disrespect one side or the other. It's just the way it is. And one thing that bugs me is that I think sometimes with this obsession about everything being so progressive, so called, the whole concept of gender identity is being modeled into what a specific group of people are defining it as. So, as a heterosexual, relatively alpha male, I appreciate feminine women. So what? That doesn't mean I don't believe in women being assertive and independent and having strength of character. I just happen to like women who are feminine, ladylike, whatever you want to call it. Um, I understand where this debate began because people sort of have this idea of a rigid 1950s gender role. Let's say, I don't know, the man goes to work 9 to 5 and the woman is a good housewife and stays at home and she has a nice big smile. And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about those sort of rigid gender roles. Of course not. That's ridiculous. We're in the year 2016. People should have equal opportunity to do whatever they want. But it is noticeable that progressives now are actually the ones who are being controlling. And they basically have this attitude that if you are a feminine woman and if you are a masculine man, then that's somehow a social construct. except that it's not. That's how people in those situations basically feel comfortable. Okay, you get controlling situations, but more often than not, it is just the way people are. And it doesn't remotely mean anything to do with control. I can honestly say my last girlfriend, for example, was very feminine, very what you would consider to be traditionally feminine. But in no way was I controlling. In no way did I tell her what to believe or tell her what to do. It's just a case of being, like the old saying, opposites attract. You even get this in homosexual relationships because you always have a more male side, a more female side. And I'm very open minded in terms of people can identify with themselves whatever way they want. But what you can't do is impose it onto others. And progressives really have a habit of doing this, of basically redefining and introducing new words to vocabulary just to suit their own politically correct agenda. And it's pathetic. And it makes communication awkward. And it makes, it's basically, that is a real social construct. That's why when you get feminists, for example, trying to sue companies because, I don't know, they have blue toys for boys and pink toys for girls. My thinking on that is no one is forcing you to buy those products. So why sue the company? Why make such a big issue out of that? They're saying that's a social construct, but who is actually trying to redefine what it is? If you have a little boy who likes girls' toys, fine, buy him girls' toys. If you have a little girl who likes boys' toys, buy her boys' toys. No one is stopping you. But you're the ones who are trying to dictate to the company how they should market the products. My thinking is, so what? No one is forcing you to buy the products. And I guess it just annoys me that we're basically moving at this kind of rapid breakneck speed with what is deemed to be progressive. Anyone who ever questions it is deemed to be backward. That's not open minded. That's deeply, deeply intolerant. Where anything goes, there's no debate, and if you don't agree with it, you're backward or you're a religious bigot or whatever. Um, those issues may exist. Bigotry does exist. I get that. But let's just get away from the fact that just because someone has a different point of view doesn't mean they're bigoted, doesn't mean they're hateful. We all need to just calm down. And if the phrase live and let live is to truly mean what it means, then stop dictating to other people how they should think. And at the moment, I think those who are most guilty of it are so called progressives. The feminist movement can arguably be seen as part of that. And to be clear, I'm not talking about every feminist. I have known feminists who have been very reasonable and decent people and open minded. But as a movement, I find it deeply intolerant. Anyway, I'm going to round this up. I've spoken for a while now. I've raised a lot of issues here. Hopefully, the audio will be okay. Let me know your thoughts. If you disagree with anything I'm saying, like as always, that's fine. Please keep it civil. But all I'm saying is that just because someone thinks in a certain way doesn't mean they're bigoted. Okay? And as for playground insults, personally I don't use them. And I think you can debate male feminists without using playground insults. A final point by the way about male feminists. I've no problem with calling yourself a male feminist. I think that there are men out there who describe themselves that way and they're genuinely motivated by compassion for women's rights. I have no problem with that. But what I do have a problem with is telling other men they have to think the same way and implying that if you don't call yourself a feminist, then you don't believe in treating women in a fair way. That's nonsense. Complete nonsense. I absolutely, passionately believe in human rights for women. So when I hear, for example, of honor killings, when I hear of women being attacked with acid, when I hear of domestic abuse situations in the UK. I read, for example, about a man who was working his girlfriend on a treadmill because he wanted to coerce her into having a certain body type. He worked her to the point where she collapsed with exhaustion. That's appalling. And I unreservedly condemn that sort of behaviour. So there's no double standards by saying that you're critical of the approach feminism takes, but you believe in women's rights. There's no inconsistency in that whatsoever. Thank you for watching.